It's loading. And now it says webinar streaming live.
Okay.
Okay.
Are we actually on or?
And you're on.
Okay. Are people here?
I think people are coming in now. Yes.
Okay. Great. So I guess I'll start. Or should I wait a minute, let people get in?
Let's give people a minute to come in because I do see that there are participants joining as we speak.
Okay.
So we can start off with saying, thank you for joining the webinar. Please be patient as we give a couple of minutes for a few more attendees to join in. Some people are joining us as we speak. All right, Angela.
Okay.
It's on you.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Angela Fobbs, the chair of the Global Black Caucus, and welcome and thank you for participating in our Women's History Month webinar. There'll be a short survey to fill out after the webinar, and it would be great if you would take the time to fill it out. Our speaker tonight is Nicole Pearson. She's a member of Democrats Abroad and the Global Black Caucus. She's a writer, activist, teacher, and entrepreneur. Nicole studied African American studies at Howard University with a focus on American political movements from slavery to the present. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and Nicole will answer them after the presentation. So with that, I'll just kick it over to Nicole. Thank you very much.
My audience, welcome. As Angela mentioned, I'm going to be talking about Black women and their long history of political activism. So I think that the model, the way that they've gone about their activism, sort of the history of the spark of that activism, a lot of that information, I think, can be very helpful strategically, specifically, but also inspirationally in terms of community of people who, how do I put this? So they're not in it to win, right? They're in it to survive. Well, and not even to survive, they're in it to thrive, right? So they're using politics and activism as a way to create a space that allows for them to thrive as human beings, right? To have work, to be educated, to live the lives that they dreamed of having. Before I begin, I want to ask a couple of questions. So I want to talk a bit about activism and sort of clarify what we're talking about when we talk about activism. But I would like for you to keep in mind, your sense of what activism is. You know, what is activism to you? What does it mean? What do you think activism can accomplish? And do you see any connection or relationship between activism and mainstream politics? And if you do, what is the nature of that connection? And if not, how do you think those two might become connected? Perhaps through hearing this story, you'll come up with some ideas, or it may change your sense of what activism and the connections are. So I have here, as you can see, activism is a very simple definition, right? It's just taking some form of action to create change, right? Social change is what it says. But actually, social change or political, economic, environmental changes to create conditions that allow people to live the best way that they possibly can, right? So we often think of this, we can think of this as individuals, or we can think of it as a movement, right? But really and truly, activism is collective, right? So that's where we start. So there's three different types of activism, right? So there's this idea that we can sort of demand solutions to problems that are happening by taking the oppositional stance, right? So, for example, lack of education, or activism can be a way that actually decides to create its own systems within a dominant structure. I think my favorite example of this might be food co-ops, right? So within sort of the structure of the capitalist food structure, right? Supermarkets, et cetera, you have spaces that were created, food co-ops, which are owned and run by the members themselves, right? Who have a much clearer connection to the food, where it's coming from, who's producing it, et cetera. So that's sort of constructing new ways within an existing system, right? And the third, which is what is called revolutionary activism, sort of questions the very premise of the structure that exists and is more concerned with creating very fundamental or transformative change. So when we're talking about Black women in activism, because of their very particular relationship that Black women have had with the dominant social, economic, and political structure, right, a capitalist structure, and being bodies within that structure that were actually valued but not given value, a lot of the times that activism that they were talking about or looking at was more transformational, right? They were much more interested in transforming a system and creating a system that moves us beyond this idea of valuing certain bodies over others. So that takes me to a quote from one of the activists that we'll be focusing on this evening, Fannie Lou Hamer. So her quote is, "The Black woman's body was never hers alone." And that's exactly right. So essentially the seed or the root of Black female activism is reclaiming, very literally, their bodies, right? The right to control their own bodies, right? To not be assaulted, to create and be however they wanted to be. So when we talk about, there is a very long and extensive history of sort of Black female resistance and Black resistance to enslavement. But for our purposes and what we're talking about this evening, we're actually going to start with a case, a rape case that happened in Alabama, because this is really in 1944. So this case, this incident is really sort of the beginning of what we understand to be the modern civil rights movement. So there's a woman named Recy Taylor who was going home one evening from a prayer meeting with a friend, and she is accosted, kidnapped, and raped, brutally raped by, I can't remember the number of men, but I think it was six men. So they basically sort of leave her for dead. She makes her way home, and she tells her family what happened. So her family immediately decides to take action, and they actually go to the police. So the case explodes because they go to the police, they file a report, and in fact, due process starts to happen. But because this is the South in 1944, the process only gets so far. The person, so this is a local case, and at the same time, there is an organization called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, who has been working tirelessly in the South, I believe starting in the 1930s, with a very specific focus on sexual assault cases against Black women. Because what they understood is that these cases of sexual assault, rape, were in fact epidemic. And no one was talking about this. So the NAACP actually sent in a young woman named Rosa Parks to help move local officials, get the word out nationally about the case, to actually move local officials to press forward and press charges and have a trial. So Rosa Parks, who we later come to know or becomes nationally known a decade later during the Montgomery bus boycott, actually got her start with the NAACP, as a field secretary. So what does that mean? She traveled throughout the South investigating, following up on various cases of sexual assault that Black women had. So she, at once with the bearing of the NAACP, was there to provide resources and also support to persuade the women to make their cases public. So Reese was actually amazing. After this incredibly traumatic experience, she was very clear that she was going to tell her story. She was going to stick to her story. She wasn't going to stop talking. So the NAACP, so this is an interesting thing in terms of any sort of idea about organizing. So you have a local incident, and you have an organization that has chapters and members locally who are able to immediately come in and provide some sort of support. Then, because it's a national organization, you have resources nationally that allow for this story and this information to move beyond the local sphere and to become national. And at this point, you also have a very strong African-American press. So there is a parallel press that's happening, right? A parallel media structure, Black-owned media structure that is able to convey what's happening and mobilize people to participate and mobilize themselves, right? To send letters, to agitate from the outside for change. So this all becomes very important when we're thinking about and talking about activism and how things actually move along. So unfortunately, Reese Taylor, her case was tried twice, which was actually pretty amazing. And it was only tried twice because of the tremendous pressure that was being put to bear on this community on a national level. Unfortunately, there were two trials, and I think they both ended in a hung jury because you have an all-white jury, and they're not going to convict their peers and their white neighbors. And so the case sort of dies and goes on without ever being any real justice. right? As many of you probably know, if you saw the Golden Globe expectant speech that Oprah Winfrey gave, she made very clear reference to this story in this situation in the context of talking about Me Too, right? And about this now national movement of women sharing their experiences of sexual harassment, sexual violence, and abuse. Another organization that was started by a Black woman. So what these stories help us to understand is something that we are not aware of, and yet is happening all around us, is that Black women are moving forward and organizing themselves and doing whatever they need to do to try to create the conditions that allow them to not only survive, but to thrive, and for their communities to thrive. But oftentimes when they do that, they're also creating conditions that make it possible for other people in other communities to do the same, right? White women are also a part of this conversation when we're talking about sexual violence and sexual abuse. And so these women coming forward, having that courage and organizing themselves and sort of being activists allows a space that creates momentum and change for other communities. I've just sort of turned the slide to a quote by an activist and suffragette, African-American suffragette, Mary Church Terrell. And her quote is, "And so lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go, struggling and striving, and hoping the buds and blossoms of our desires will bear fruit," I can't see my screen, "into glorious fruition ere long." So I love this quote and I love this woman, but I think the quote is important because it's a very specific about the unspoken philosophy of sort of Black women activists, that they're very clear that they're striving, they're climbing, they're improving, their fight to improve conditions is not only about them, right? But it's about anyone else that they can bring along in that struggle, right? African-American women understood themselves to be, if not the most vulnerable, one of the most vulnerable populations within our US democracy. And so they always had an eye out and have an eye out for the most vulnerable people in the communities that they work in and serve. So that is in fact a very specific aspect of Black female political activism that I think it's really important to highlight. You know, this isn't a contest. This isn't about winning. This is about creating the best possible conditions that allows the least among us to not only survive, but to thrive. So the next slide that I've turned to is actually a gallery of women from the 19th century who were very instrumental in laying the groundwork that actually takes us to the modern civil rights movement. So you have Mary McLeod Bethune, Mary Church Terrell, you have Sojourner Truth. What we don't know, and what may be new information for you, is that a lot of these women were suffragettes, right? So alongside the fight against lynching, against sexualized violence, and against women, Black women, they were also fighting for the right to vote. So the other thing that I think gets lost when we talk about political struggles is that we get a bit tunnel vision, right? We sort of think of it as mono cause, like one cause and then another cause. But I think what the experiences of Black women activists tell us is that they were very cognizant that they were fighting on multiple levels and therefore felt very entitled and to fight for multiple things. So I think, you know, if we, and I'll get to this when I talk a little bit more about the idea of intersectionality and identity politics, I know that that word is a very much a trigger word, but it actually has its roots in Black female activists sort of finding out and naming their position vis-a-vis the hierarchical structures that they live within and the various oppressions that they are dealing with. But I think it's possible for us to expand and understand our focus and our activism as being multi-layered and multi-connected. So anyway, so I'll get to Ella Baker in a second, but I want to continue the story. So Recy Taylor, nothing changes for her, really, right? There is no acknowledgement until just a few years ago of what even had happened to her. The Alabama state legislature just a few years ago did offer a formal apology, and she was honored by then President Barack Obama. But she actually never received justice in her lifetime. She died in December of last year. She had a very long life, but died knowing that people did acknowledge what had happened to her without ever getting justice. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. So in 1954, right, we come to the Montgomery bus boycott. And I'm sorry, I think I might be getting my dates not in the right order. So basically a decade out from the Recy Taylor case, which exploded in the African-American press and created awareness, at least within the African-American community, of the extent of the sexualized violence that Black women were facing, you had the Montgomery bus boycott. So what most people really don't know about the Montgomery bus boycott is that, in fact, it was started and organized by Black women. So these were Black women who were experiencing horrendous physical, sort of sexual attention, right? Being groped, being touched in all these ways, right? They were going to work many, many hours in the homes of other white people. And on top of having all of that, they were navigating this experience of being brutally sexualized and in really gross ways. So, they said enough was enough, right? So the boycott happens from 1955 to 1956. But in fact, at various points between 1944 and 1954, there's lots of things happening, right? There are little boycotts, there are little things happening, but nothing really has as much momentum as the Montgomery bus boycott is to generate. So why was that? Well, there were a couple of things. So before Rosa Parks was actually arrested, there were a number of people who were arrested. One of them was a young girl who was actually 16 years old, who just had enough. And she really was like, no, I'm not moving from my seat. And so she was put in jail, this young girl. And, this just sort of horrified the community. And people, mostly Black women, were like, what? We got to do something. We're not dealing with this anymore. So they came up with a nonviolent strategy. So in the 10 years, 1944 to 1954, you already have women who are organized, right? So you have women who are supporting one another in these experiences of traumatic sexual violence. And they have a pretty amazing community base in the church. So a lot of these women are members of churches. So they're doing charity, they're doing other organizing. So again, in each of these communities, and now we're talking about Montgomery, Alabama, you have a very specific setup of mutual aid and support already in place, right? So they had to choose a leader. They had to choose someone to come in to actually be the face of that movement. And that's where we get a very young Martin Luther King Jr., right? So in fact, one of the women, initial organizers, was the one who recommended Martin Luther King Jr. So in terms of the story that we end up telling, and I think it's very important to look at how we tell the stories of this kind of activism, we're sort of left with this idea that Martin Luther King Jr. is a leader and he organized all these people and all this stuff happened, when the reverse is actually true. The mechanisms of organization were already in place when Martin Luther King Jr. is invited in to be the face and the voice of a movement that's already in place. So this is very important to remember and very important for us to keep in mind when we talk about activism and organizing on any level and in any way. If we do not keep that into account, then we really have lost a sense of what this kind of work is. So just a few statistics, right? So the bus boycott went on for 381 days. 40,000 African Americans boycotted those buses for 381 days. So there is a very specific mechanism or set of mechanisms in place that allow for that to be true, right? There are carpools that are happening. There are weekly meetings to keep everybody abreast of what's going on, to keep everybody's morale up. There's an ongoing list of demands of the changes that they're looking for. So in those 381 days, people are engaged on almost a daily level in terms of what it means to keep this going and what the changes they're looking for are. So they don't go into this looking to win, right? They go into this looking for change, right? They go into this not just looking for the ability to sit wherever they want on the bus, right? But they go into this for the ability to be in public spaces without fear of harassment, to be in whatever public space without bearing the burden of Jim Crow laws. So what do I want to say? I think that's it. So that is really where the spark starts to happen. And this movement sort of enters into the national consciousness. So at least a decade before that happens, a lot of groundwork has been done. A lot of support, a lot of networks have been created that make the next decade of that movement possible. So as we get to the next decade of that movement, we must talk about a woman named Ella Josephine Baker. So Ella Josephine Baker, personally, is the secret sauce of the civil rights movement. So she was very particular about not taking up much space, not being out in front, not seeing herself as a leader, but as someone who developed leadership in others. So this takes me to her quote. I have always thought, let me see if I can move I love technology, but it's in my way. I have always thought that what is needed is the development of people who are interested not in being leaders as much as in developing leadership in others. So this was very much the core philosophy of Ella Baker's work. So she comes in as an organizer. She had been doing work. She worked along with W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, A. Philip Randolph, as well as Martin Luther King Jr., right? And she mentored activists such as Diane Nash. If you don't know who she is, you can get into it at another moment, but that woman is spectacular. Stokely Carmichael, aka Kwame Ture, right, who becomes head of the Black Power movement. Rosa Parks, she was a mentor of Rosa Parks as well, and Bob Moses, who we will get to in a few moments, right? So she was very much interested in grassroots organizing and radical democracy. So what does that mean? So she's talking about democracy that is in the hands of the oppressed themselves. The people who are oppressed become the leaders, become the organizers of their own liberation. So she is by far one of the most important women of the civil rights movement that you've never heard of. And if you have, that's amazing. But in a general sense, in our culture, in our history, she has largely been left out. I think because of the way she questions the legitimacy of the structure, the political structure as it exists, right? So I'm just gonna give another quote from her before we move on. In order for us as poor and oppressed people to become part of a society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means that we are going to have to learn to think in radical terms. I use the term radical in its original meaning, getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system, right? So that's Ella Baker. There will be a link, or there is a link in the resources documents to an amazing speech that she gives for the Puerto Rican independence struggle in 1974, talking about the struggle and the daily reality of that, right? That this is not something that you win one day, that you engage in and becomes a part of your life. Okay. Another person that I want to focus on is Fannie Lou Hamer. So she is another very beloved and important part of the civil rights struggle, the civil rights or the Southern freedom or liberation movement, as it is also called. So Fannie Lou Hamer is a sharecropper from Mississippi who gets recruited as a person on the ground to go and to register to vote fellow members from her community. So I think this is also a very important thing to point out. Leadership as such was not interested in having people from the outside to go in if they didn't have to, right? They were very much about building leadership within communities and having those people be on the ground and getting other people involved. And I think this is so important. This idea of hierarchical power that we enforce when we sort of have this idea of a leader and then various little people who go around doing things is very much upended by the actual strategic work and organizing of the civil rights movement. And what Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker are two very huge reasons why that's true. So she was a sharecropper, right? And she worked in Mississippi. She was responsible for organizing Mississippi Freedom Summer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and she was the chair of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which we'll get into in a moment. And I forgot to mention, so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was actually an initiative of Ella Baker's. She went into the leadership, Martin Luther King Jr., and the top leadership, and demanded that they create a space which allowed young people to develop their leadership skills. And so she got money from them and a bit of founding, and she actually pushed them really hard to make that happen. But that's how we got SNCC, right? The Student Nonviolent Organizing Committee. That's how you go from that to Freedom Summer, and coordinating and connecting with thousands of young people across the country who then go and decide to volunteer and lend a hand to organizing efforts in the South. So you've probably already read the quote while I was talking, but you know, I think this quote really speaks to the spirit of who this woman was. You know, she was like, you know, they couldn't kill me, right? The only thing they could do was kill her. And by not resisting, by not finding a way to work towards transforming the situation, she would have been dying a bit every day anyway, because that's what these oppressive structures do. So it's just such a huge reminder and a huge lesson that the engagement in activism and the engagement in transforming your circumstances in and of itself is powerful, right? And gives you a certain sense of power and autonomy. So again, Fannie Lou Hamer runs for Congress. We don't have the clip where she's talking a bit about herself and her experiences. So the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, I want to take a pause to talk about this. So Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and Bob Moses, one of Ella Baker's mentees, in 1964, decide to create their own political party, right? So the organization was a mixed organization, right? It had African Americans and whites. So what was very unique and interesting about it is that these were the most vulnerable people in those communities. These are the poorest people. You know, these are the people who are coming together to create a party to advocate for their rights. So Mississippi Freedom Summer, actually, so Freedom Summer objective was very specifically, and this is not explained very much, was not just to register people to vote, but to get these folks to join the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which they did to amazing success. They signed up 80,000 members, right? So this might be hard to think about, but this is in 1964 in the deep South, right? Where people are being murdered still being murdered for deigning to look a white person in the face, right, in the eyes. So the fact that they were able to do that and create a political party with real momentum was an absolute testimony to their level of organizing and the tremendous work that they did. So here are just some pictures, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party button. The woman in light blue is actually Recy Taylor. There's another picture of Fannie Lou Hamer. So these are all pictures, I think, that are really representative of this sort of principled, non-compromising activism that Black women in the United States demonstrated then and actually continue to demonstrate, right? So there's a whole lot more we could say about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the horrendous experience that they had in the Democratic National Convention and the ways that they were completely snubbed. But I'm not interested in getting into that right now. I'm more interested in continuing to talk about how these women saw themselves the amazing work that they did despite very, very challenging circumstances. And, you know, despite the fact that they didn't win, continued to have a base of support and work that actually takes us to the present time, and some of the most current elections in the South, which we'll get to. But before I do that, I want to take a pause, and I want to talk a little bit about another side of Black female activism. So while Black women are doing this work, they're actively engaged in the struggle for creating, change, of transforming a society and making it a place that actually has a place for them. They were also doing some analytical work. They're sort of trying to understand their position so that they could be better or clearer about how they're approaching, how they're looking for change or making change or looking to transform the society. So this is what takes us to the Combahee River Collective, which was a group that was created in Boston in 1974. So as you can see from the slide, you know, this is taken from, again, I'm not sure how very well known this is, but Harriet Tubman's Civil War raid was the most successful, the largest slave rescue ever, right? She sends a boat down the Combahee River, like emancipating slaves from the different plantations, all while going down the river, right? It is an incredible story. So these women took that name, and this group was a group of activists, Black female activists who had been involved in the women's movement, who had been involved in the civil rights movement, you know, who were involved in the anti-war movement, who didn't find a place for themselves really in those movements. Their work and the activism that they were looking for wasn't reflected. Their concerns, their very specific concerns, were not being reflected. So they decided to create their own group and sort of investigate and understand what this was about. So one of the things to know for any of you literary folks out there, Audre Lorde, a very beloved writer, poet, incredible woman, was a part of the group. And also, interestingly enough, Charlene McRae, who is now the First Lady of New York City. So it's this group that in their manifesto or collective statement that they wrote, coined the term identity politics. They were looking for a term that could help to explain how they might position themselves or be positioned within any sort of a social, economic, and political structure. So they understood that the point for the various oppressions that they were facing was their identity as women, right? As Black people, as often working class women, or gay or lesbian women, right? So they created an understanding of their position based on the identities that they held, because that coincided with the oppressions that they faced. And so from that position, they had a clearer understanding of the connection to other oppressed communities that they intersected with and belonged to, which allowed for them to think about their work and their activism in a completely different way. Again, not single issue work, right? But community work, and being able to look very specifically in communities and see what's happening, and actually focus themselves on the most vulnerable within those communities. So anyway, there's some photos of these ladies, of Audre Lorde. Kitchen Table Press was a publication house that comes directly out of this collective, right? So again, they're creating so we're not thinking of activism as narrowly political in the sense of we're changing politics, but activism as a way that creates language, that creates narratives that help to explain and to give context to the activism and the struggles that they're participating in. So we're taking another leap to talk about Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter is an organization that was started by 3 young working class Black women, right? So as many of you know, it was started as a hashtag. So it wasn't a movement as such, but it was a hashtag, which meant it created a virtual space that allowed for Black people to talk about how devastated they were when George Zimmerman ends up being acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. So Black Lives Matter is a direct descendant of these Black female activism in their movements, right? Their statement, Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black queer and trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. It centers those that have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. It is a tactic to rebuild the Black liberation movement. So one of the reasons that they are very specific in talking about marginalized communities, even within the Black community, is because what ends up happening at the end of the civil rights movement and the beginning into the Black Power movement, Black Panthers, yada, 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 we can't get into any of that now, is that in fact, those movements like Black Power movements and the Black Panther movements are sort of a reaction to the mainstream civil rights movement's decision to create an image that basically was focused on already mobile, upwardly mobile African Americans, right? So middle class folks, right? And sort of middle class issues. So affirmative action, just a middle class issue, but the way that it gets framed in terms of talking about education and talking about jobs sort of left an entire community of very poor people like the Fannie Lou Hamers from these smaller rural communities or very devastated urban communities out. So Black Lives Matter very specifically positions itself to bring those marginalized folks who are in fact dealing with the most repressive and oppressive aspects of institutionalized racism, of economic injustice into the fold, and to put their issues squarely at the center of activism work, political activism. Anyway, a lovely video that is on the resource page. I highly recommend you watching it. It's lovely to hear these women talk very specifically about who they are and their experiences that have lent themselves to create this worldwide movement, right? So Black Lives Matter is very interesting. I think it's very interesting to talk about as Democrats abroad, and something else that doesn't get mentioned very often. Black Lives Matter has chapters around the world, right? We have a chapter in Madrid, there's a chapter in London, I believe there's a chapter in France. And so what is their connection, right? Their connection is sort of state sanctioned or institutionalized racism, right? Institutionalized racism kills wherever, right? So in fact, I won't get into details, but we're struggling right now in Spain with institutionalized racism and the incredible oppressive forces that it brings to bear on immigrant African folks who are coming over and trying to get started. So 2 people have died in the past couple of days. if not directly at the hands of police, as a part of a failure, well, of an institutionalized racist structure that refuses to permit people of African descent to become residents or citizens. Long story, we won't get into it now. So from now we're going to start to look at other movements, right? Activist movements that were started by Black women. So the Me Too movement is now a phenomenon, right? It's everywhere. It's such a huge part of how we're able to talk about the sexual harassment and sexual violence that women have faced in whatever facet of life or work you want to talk about. But to bring it back, this movement was actually started more than a decade ago by Tarana Burke. And she created the hashtag in very much the same way that the Black Lives Matter hashtag was created, as a space for survivors of sexual violence, but specifically women of color, to be able to voice and talk about their experiences, right? So that was only the beginning, like Black Lives Matter, right? So we start with a space. We start with naming a phenomenon, right? Naming a kind of oppression that's occurring. But we go from there and we build community to help survivors heal from that experience, right? And it's so great to hear Tarana Burke talk about that, because she says, you know, healing is that nice work that we do where we voice what's happening. But, you know, the other part of that is creating change, structural change, that prevents this from happening, or when it does happen, make sure mechanisms are in place that are humane and that allow, you know, traumatized victims of this violence to be able to find justice, right? So hashtag Me Too, Congress bill, right? It's a bill in Congress. And one of the things they're trying to do is get rid of that 90-day cooling off period. But in other communities, so depending on the communities that they're in, they're also pushing for other things, right? So in some communities, they're really pushing for rape kits. In other communities, you know, they're working to change sexual harassment policies, et cetera. So as I've said in the notes, they are redefining sexual violence as a social justice issue, right? So again, the experience of Black women, right, who have had the brunt of sexual violence for centuries, right? Understanding this is a part of social justice. This is a part of when you are not fully enfranchised into a society, socially, politically, or economically. You are vulnerable to all of these kinds of things. So re-enfranchising, reintegrating, and transforming what we understand to be our social, political, and economic structures, so that it opens up space for all of these people who have been marginalized. So this is from a document that you can also find in the resources. I just wanted to highlight a few things and sort of encapsulate what I hope the stories that I've shared and the information that I've talked about helps us to understand about why Black female activism is so important and can be such an important tool to broaden our larger sense of what political organizing can be about. So they talk about institution building alongside education, right? There's no either or here. Like, things are working in concert because they know that that's how it has to be, right? Black voting has been a thing since forever, right? Because again, this is a reluctance. You know, African Americans come from a community and a country that has been absolutely reluctant to fully enfranchise them and give them the full rights of citizenship. And that has been the fight from the beginning, right? So they really know how to organize against that. They really know so specifically what that looks like. If we want to talk about Alabama, right, and we will talk about that in a moment, what they understood is that it wasn't just about electing particular officials, right? That they're talking about poverty. They're talking about reproductive health and reproductive rights. They definitely understand and see the struggle as being connected to all of these things: education, economics, health. So again, I think Black women are automatically, in their activism, multi-issue organizers, right? Because they're working on all of these fronts because they don't have the luxury to choose one over the other. So as I close, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of other, I'm going to branch out a little bit from specifically Black female organizing to talk about, well, Black female led or Black female organized political activist groups. So I'm going to talk about a group called Black PAC, which you may not have heard of, but these guys were part of a lovely combination of secret sauce that got the victory in Alabama that we saw, and are also responsible for the victory in Virginia. Very specifically in Alabama, they had people on the ground knocking on, I don't have my number here, but it was an astonishing number. I think it was 800,000 homes, right? To get people out to vote. Black PAC is very interesting because I was just talking about sort of more working class on the ground activism and organizing and organizations, but Black PAC is in fact a group of African-American CEOs and higher ups in a lot of very famous and important corporations who had been working separately, who decided to pool their money together. And why am I talking about them? Because they don't go out and do the work, but they use their money to connect with organizations that are already on the ground. So they identify who these groups are, and they give them money and resources that allows them to do the work that they do. So when I say Black PAC knocked on 800,000 doors, it wasn't them, but it was organizations on the ground that they funded that did that. So one of those organizations is the Alabama Organizing Project, right? So the Alabama Organizing Project started or came together in 2003. So the Alabama Organizing Project, or AOP, is actually a collaboration of 6 organizations, right? So we have the Coalition Against Hunger, the Federation of Child Care Centers of Alabama, Southern Cooperatives, Greater Birmingham Ministries, the Hispanic Interest Coalition. So this is mobilizing low-income families and communities and supporting them, aka Ella Baker, to advocate on their own behalf for policy and community change, right? So again, the commitment of Black female activism and activists to empowering people and to having their eye and their focus on the most vulnerable is embedded in the work of this group. And finally, I'm going to end talking about one of the many rising stars, Black female politicians, Stacey Abrams. So Stacey Abrams is a woman who's starting to get a bit more national exposure. She's a House Minority Leader in Georgia for the General Assembly, as well as a state representative. And she is a gubernatorial candidate for Georgia, just so you know. And again, her impulse for getting into politics, because she comes from a very normal family, was her sense of injustice or justice, right? Of having been denied certain levels of accessibility, and deciding to go into politics to become someone who advocates for people who don't have their own voices, who aren't able to advocate for themselves. So I think when we think about politicians, right, Democratic politicians, I think if we reimagine how we organize from the grassroots level, then I think it changes what we're looking for and talking about in terms of our politicians, right? We're not looking for people to do for us, but we're looking for people who have our ear and who will work with these marginalized communities to create change, right? So this is another reason why Black female candidates can be very appealing, because of our particular experience of being in the margins and working our ways in. We are particularly focused and sensitized as one of those more vulnerable members of society to prioritizing and making the changes necessary that really allow for full development and enfranchisement of all of the people in every community, and not, unfortunately, the way politics is very much rolling out now, for the few, for the elite, for those who are able to grab enough power to make change. Okay, I think I've said a whole bunch, and I think it's about an hour in, so I want to leave time for questions and for some form of engagement. I know it's going to be weird because you guys are typing in questions, but for me, this is important that there is a bit of an interaction. I feel very uncomfortable just sort of giving you information and telling you things without finding a way for us to interact with it, to get your feedback, your understanding. And so I just want to say one more thing. 100 million people don't vote or didn't vote. That's more people than voted. So we have a whole bunch of people out here who are completely disenfranchised, and with very good reason. So I think looking at Black female political activism and the ways that they imagine and do that work will be really important and can allow for us to engage, connect, and empower those marginalized people to become a part of this and to help create the changes that we're all looking for. So thank you.
So Nicole, we have a question from Callie. The question is, how does the Democratic Party need to change to make a place for intersectional politics? Can we do it within the framework of neoliberalism that white and some Black Democratic elites push on us? Or do we need to take a stance against neoliberalism and embrace a more radical progressive politics? If so, where do we start? That's a very simple question.
Yeah, great. Love starting off like that. Thanks. Yeah. And I'm actually not going to answer that question. No, I think a lot of what I said speaks for itself. I think that, inherently a neoliberal political and economic outlook is how do I want to say this, is still working very much against the interests of these communities, right? Who are incredibly vulnerable economically, politically, on all levels. I don't see neoliberalism as providing even an adequate response to the situation that these very vulnerable communities are facing. But I think this is part of the work, right? And I think this is part of going in and going back and reading about these women and what they said. They had very specific critiques of capitalism, right? And we're very suspicious of neoliberalism, I think for very good reason. They have yet to see any positive results of those policies in these more vulnerable communities.
Okay, are there any other questions from anyone? I'd like to answer that question.
Do it.
Yes, we have to fight against neoliberalism. If we're ever going to live in a just world, we can't live, everything can't stay the same, and that's got to be one of the first things to go. That's how I feel.
Right there with you.
Okay, let me just check really quick and see if there's any more questions.
Or comments. I mean, I asked some questions before about activism. How does this change your perspective of ideas of what activism can do, its potential? Do you guys think? Yeah.
Here's a question. It's a question from Lori Kay. Her question is, why are there not more women of color speaking out on this issue, and the issue is Black Lives Matter?
Well, I don't have any idea why. I don't know who those women are.
Oh, sorry. I am misreading that question.
Okay.
It's about the Me Too movement, rather.
Okay. I mean, I don't know, because one of the things that's very interesting having this talk and talking about Black political activism is that this work has been going on and has been ongoing the whole time. So I don't know if that these women aren't speaking out or if they just haven't been heard, right? I mean, Tarana Burke started Me Too in 2006, and she's been organizing and doing work that whole time. So I would push back on that question a little bit, and because I think it's a little bit about how the media decides what's important and who they focus on. And in fact, I would say that some of the, what's the word I'm looking for? The success of Black female activism is that it's gone largely under the radar. People are able to move on and do what they need to do without scrutiny or whatever.
Okay. We have just another couple of quick comments. Isn't that the complaint? For example, the Parkland High School kids get heard, but Black youth working against violence, their voices aren't magnified by the press.
I mean, yeah, their voices aren't magnified by the press. I mean, you know, earlier in my presentation, one of the most important things about organizing on a national level for Black folks was the incredible press, Black-owned, Black-operated press that circulated these stories and this information. So, I mean, I'm not sure that looking at mainstream press for information is going to do it. I mean, for example, like doing my research and doing all that I've done, I've spent hours digging around and finding out about on-the-ground organizations in North Carolina and in Georgia, as well as in Alabama and Mississippi. And I have been amazed at what I've seen. And none of those folks are getting any kind of press until the moment a Roy Moore event happens, right? But, you know, they've been around for years and they continue to do that work without people knowing about it. So I don't know what the implication is in terms of us who want to interact with them is, except I've started with a list of resources and some information where you can find out more, and we go from there.
Okay, let's see if we have anything else. There's a question, what other press sources would you recommend?
Oh, I have a whole list. I can actually send that. That's a whole other set of resources that I've made, not just in terms of press, but in terms of writers, right? Academics, journalists who are focused on issues around school resegregation and all kinds of stuff. So I'll talk to Angela about getting that list out there. But again, this is all just work I did myself because I said, no, I am not satisfied with what I'm seeing, and I'm going to take some time to investigate, keep my ears out, and see who's out there talking about these issues. So I'm more than happy to share that with everyone. But unfortunately, there's been work, right? There's no one easy click to find this information.
Yes, you can give it to me. And if you're looking for resources for any occasion, you can go to our website, democratsabroad.bc, and there's a resources button there, and you can find resources for this presentation and other things that have come up since we've existed. We have a little comment. It is the issue of Black Lives Matter movement. I live in Paris, France, and it is important to make white folks feel comfortable. I wish there was a little bit more with that. I'd like to.
Yeah. Well, I see part of this. More. Is this from Cheryl? Or is that from another person? Because she says,
yes,
I believe education
Cheryl.
Is very important for self-esteem. Question, I find that I must explain to white folks what Black Lives Matter is about. What do you think about that? Yeah, so this is, I'm laughing because I actually work as an intercultural facilitator for an American university. And I talk about this kind of stuff all the time. With students of color who are like, wow, is it always a teaching moment for me? Really? And, white folks who are scared to death, who don't want to fuck up, who want to say something, but are not sure how. So I think that it takes courage for people to be open about the discrimination that they experience. But that the more that we're actually able to do that and have those conversations, the more normalized it becomes for white folks, in the sense of that really is just what's happening every day in our lives, right? So this is actually a practice I've been starting to do with mixed results, I'll be honest, right? Because, it feels hard and it's often frustrating to feel like you have to explain something that seems obvious to you. But that's the nature of the inherently racist, sexist, and frankly, white supremacist societies that we live in, is that it just invisibilizes us, right? We're very visible visually, but our experiences are completely invisible. So, part of my always calling things out and being like, wow, that's really racist, is a way of putting that out there. That's not always easy, right? But for white folks who have any inkling of being interested or curious, there are some amazing websites that you can check out. Actually, I'll put a link in my resources for this that get more into that. But, a lot of that for white folks is just believe what people tell you. If a trans person is telling you something, if a person of color is telling you something, believe them. Right? The questioning of that simply because you haven't had that experience is so awful, because you're really questioning that person's reality, right? And you're minimizing whatever their experience was. So as difficult as it is to hear about those things, it's just as difficult for people to say. So take a little faith in what people are saying. And if you really don't know, you can get online and find out.
We have another question from Erica. Would it have been different for Black Lives Matter members if they ran for various offices in their cities?
They are.
Were they encouraged to run? Okay.
Yeah, they are running. In Ferguson, I just talked to a friend of mine who lives here who's from Ferguson, and she was so excited. 3 members of Black Lives Matter ran for office, and she voted for them. So the thing is, this stuff is happening, right? I mean, part of what's interesting about all this is because, you know, there's a certain narrative that the mainstream media wants to maintain. They're not necessarily interested in these stories, but it's also that they don't necessarily see them, right? I think Angela, the Global Black Caucus group, shared a link to a piece that I passed on to her from this amazing podcast called On the Media. And On the Media is a weekly program that actually critiques the way the news spins, it not only spins stories, but the stories they decide to focus on and the nature of the things they decide to focus on. But a few weeks ago, they did an amazing program where they talked about the way that racism is and is not talked about, and that the very way that racism is discussed specifically. Now, they have talked about class as well, which is another podcast I would recommend, actually obscures the true nature of what that is. So when you miss that, there's so much more you're missing. You're missing what people are actually doing within that, right, to change it. I mean, that doesn't answer
we
your
have
question.
another question from Cuthbert. His question is, do the most effective political strategies in northern urban areas and political strategies in southern rural areas work together?
I'm not sure what you mean by that question. I have no idea. I mean, I really don't. You know, an area to look at in terms of political activism is the South. I will tell you now, the Moral Monday movement that's happening down there, which is this incredible coalition led by a minister named Reverend Barber, but is a coalition of various grassroots organizations, white and black, Latino, young and old. I mean, the South is really a reference, I think. I think people are missing out if they're not paying any attention to North Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, because they are on it in terms of the work that they're doing. It is amazing.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
Moral Mondays. Someone else was like, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't look like. This is the time to ask your question. We have 8 minutes or something like that. So if you have a question, this is the time.
Ooh, yes, someone mentioned, and I'm remiss for not saying, but yes, Moral Mondays, the rebirth of the Poor People's Campaign. So that movement is explicitly decided to take up the mantle of Martin Luther King Jr.'s last initiative before he was assassinated. We could go into Martin Luther King Jr. a whole other time, but the last year of his life is woefully neglected in the incredible work he was doing and critique he was making about capitalism. So if we want to talk about neoliberalism, let's go back. Martin Luther King Jr. would not have been a fan, I guarantee you. This guy had a very specific critique about capitalism and the ways in which it used poor people to run its wars, to do its work, and threw them to the side. So his idea of organizing communities of poor people and talking about economics was something that made him very, very dangerous and much more of a threat in terms of how he was looking to transform activism and politics.
There's another quick question, but I just wanted to let everybody know that I posted this on Facebook, I believe this week, but there is going to be a Black television network channel on cable. A bunch of executives are getting together, and the FAMU Journalism School will soon be the host of a new 24-hour news network. And it's,
Wow.
yeah, so that's going to, it's actually should be up and running on cable in America now.
Wow.
Yeah. AFMU.
Yeah.
That is, I don't know what school that is, to be honest.
That's
but
Florida.
something Florida.
EMEA,
Yeah,
which
some
is
Florida school.
African Methodist University. I could be getting
Yeah.
it wrong. I think that's right though.
Yes. Okay. And the last question was, or not the last question, the one that. No, it's not. Okay. In the article that I'm looking at, it's listed as FAMU.
Yeah, FAMU. That would be great.
All right. So the last question is, how do we encourage young people to become active or become conscious?
I mean, you know what? I got to say, I feel for young people right now. I think there's a whole lot going on and it seems real hard. But I think that you have to engage their imaginations. Tell them stories. You know, there's so much they don't know. But I think that we're really remiss because we're not telling them stories or, you know, putting books in front of them. I mean, I'm dealing with a lot of young university students, and from my sense is that they're quite overwhelmed. But, you know, no one's really telling them stories about things. I mean, maybe about your own personal experiences, not maybe with activism or changing things, but what have you faced in your life? If you are the parent of a young person, what about your parents? I mean, those stories constitute, you know, our experience, and in those stories are the ways we actually have been able to overcome. And I think there's inspiration in them to keep moving forward and to not be satisfied with what is going on now, right? So I don't think it has to be as hard or complicated as we make it. Engage with them, tell them things, tell them about your life, tell them about their grandparents' lives. You know, they don't have any idea. And for me, that just is a bit heartbreaking, right? That's why I put these talks together. I talk to Spanish students here as well as international students and American students, and I can tell you they're amazed. They come away and their faces look different because someone's told them something. It's not just now. There's a whole context in which they're living in. Okay. Oh, there was another question about African American activist movements and African political movements. Absolutely, my friend. Are you kidding? Where did W.E.B. Du Bois died in Africa, right? Like the Black Panther movement had a sede, sorry, that's Spanish, had a headquarters in Tunisia, I think it was. They were very much involved in liberation struggles around the world, and they explicitly made connections with them when they talked about their experiences in the United States, right? I mean, it's one of the things I'm actually looking to do right now. I mean, I'm working with Afro-Spanish people and the African immigrant community, right? So those are two different communities, number one, which people don't realize, to make those connections, because what we're talking about is institutionalized structures of oppression and racism and white supremacy. And how do they play out? In every place they play out, Black people are killed. This is not okay. They're killed by the state, or the state is somehow tied in responsible with their deaths. So, you know, that's a prime point right there to start working from. But yeah, I mean, if you go back and look at Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, you know, these guys were very clear. James Baldwin, they were very clear about the connections. Maya Angelou, right, who spoke how many languages? 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5, if not 6 different languages. You know, they were traveling, they were connecting with communities of the diaspora. I think it's so important. I think as a global Black caucus, we have a really unique opportunity to be able to do that, actually. And I think that's really powerful. And that would really be powerful, us coming from the United States, who are always looked at as such a reference in the rest of the world, to explicitly link ourselves to the local struggles that are brothers and sisters are facing, because often in the communities we live in, they are the most vulnerable, or at least one of the most vulnerable communities.
We have another question. How do we get the powers that be to respond to the interest of young people? Let me start over. Basically, how do we get people to respond to our needs, especially the needs of young people? That's a difficult question.
Yeah, I was like, that's actually another talk that I'm working on, to talk more specifically about organizing strategies, right? And that takes years, guys. That is not tomorrow. That's not even next week. Oh, it's definitely not next year, right? That's creating an infrastructure and a groundswell of people who are agitating, right? Who have that in their consciousness. So, the work of activism and organizing is that. It's connecting, it's empowering, it's educating, and being educated about people's experiences and issues, and coming together to figure out ways of dealing with that. That is the beauty of the civil rights movement. It is so amazing how they did that. People really cannot talk about that enough. There are not enough books that go into the work, the intelligence that came together to make that possible, that struggle possible.
We have one more question. Do you have any people you follow or recommend that we watch out for when it comes to activism and participation?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry. The question actually says, Nicole and Angela, do you have any people you follow or recommend that we watch out for when it comes to activism and participation?
I follow a lot of people. Again, my resource list, I just love going back to that. It's got all my people on there. A person, Eric Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative. If you don't know who that man is, OMG, please get on that guy's tip, because he's amazing. He's a lawyer who, the Equal Justice Initiative is out of Alabama. He did the work about lynchings and actually getting the actual numbers of people who were lynched, thousands of people. Anyway, but he has worked in the criminal justice system for many, many, many years. He has a book called Just Mercy, which is stunningly beautiful. But the work that he's doing in terms of educating people about our past in the United States, and the work that he does advocating for young people within the criminal justice system now is incredible. So I would definitely get with that guy. There's more in my list. He comes up on the top though, because he's consistently so lovely, beautiful. Find out about his work, about the museum that they're opening. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Brian, thank you, Brian Stevenson.
Brian Stevenson.
Thank you. So the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI.
Okay. We have 1 minute left. Are there any more questions?
Oh, cool. Somebody says they're going to do a program this Saturday. Yes, no, I didn't want to negate the negative impacts that, entrenched, institutionalized racism places on all of us. But what I think the Black Lives Matter movement correctly addresses is the fact that for years, those communities were left in the dust. And, their criminal behavior or negative behavior was somehow attributed to something bad that they did. When we now understand that poverty creates violence and poverty creates violence. That's just how poverty works. So whether it's a white community or a Black community or whatever, that's what we're talking about. So I think when they focus on that and they demand that we see that, they help us to understand, the real focus, which is absolute, awful, institutionalized oppression and economic marginalization in a system that benefits off of our marginalization. That's how we're able to be exploited, right? Or any marginalized community is able to be exploited. So, they helped us to focus in on that. But no, the effects of this are devastating to all of us. And when we help the least of those, we help all of ours, right?
Yes. Okay. So I have one last question, and then I think we should go. It says paranoid about Black Lives Matter. What can we do? I'm not sure there's anything you can do to
well,
make
anyway,
paranoid people
what
feel
about the
better.
fact in France are becoming institutionalism is, yeah. Well, I mean, you have to speak out about this. You have to, what's been really amazing here is watching the community of Afro-Spanish and African immigrants really, and people of color in Spain, they have honed in their message. They're like, we're not talking about you taking this personally. We're not even trying to take your racism personally, but people are dying. We understand this is from an institution. This is a top-down deal, and we want to address the laws at the top of this, right? We're not trying to change your heart. We're not trying to help you. You don't need to feel better about us, but the injustice and your attitudes come from above. It's not the other way around. So I'm so proud of the work that, they've been doing, that we've all been doing together to really hone in on that message. So yeah, let's keep institutionalized racism. Institutionalized racism. The UN was just here and Spain is in so much trouble. The UN, Amnesty International, and the European group on racial discrimination have all called out Spain on its institutionalized racism. What's happening in France? Are they not having that there? Because France has got some serious problems too, right? So that's something we can talk about. How do we shift the focus of these things to talk about what's happening, where this phenomenon is coming from?
I believe we have a question from DeWitt, but he didn't write what it was. Can you please write it? What your question is? Well.
Okay.
Well. Okay. Maybe not. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Nicole, for doing such a great job. This is also, it will be available on Facebook. It was streaming on Facebook Live, so you can always share it out if you think other people need to see this. And we hope that you will join us again soon for another webinar.
Right. Thank you so much, Angela, for inviting me to do it. And let's do a part 2 where we talk some grid down and dirty about some actual activist organizing strategy.
You just tell me when you're ready, and we'll do it again. Thank you so much, and everybody have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. I just sent out the poll to everyone.
I saw that.
Take a minute of your time and answer these questions. It would be a great help. If you have any other ideas for future webinars and want to run that by us, please send it in an email to info@democratsabroad.org. And always, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes. Thank everyone. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, I guess I can.
Well, really glad we recorded that.
Oh, that's great. I didn't realize it was being recorded. That's
Yes,
great.
it's being recorded, so we can just share it everywhere.
Awesome.